Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Build Your Copywriting Business podcast. Hey there, Kate.
Hello, hello.
Hello. Okay, today we are going to dig into a juicy topic. If you're interested in copywriting and thinking, okay, where am I going to make the most money? Now, obviously, it's not all about money. There are plenty of other wonderful reasons to get into this field. Very fulfilling, the opportunity to do creative and strategic work, but also we
have bills to pay.
We got bills to pay. Exactly. So we're going to talk about what are some of the highest paying niches in copywriting. But before we do that,
if you're like, Nicki, Kate, we've heard you talk before, and you say, don't niche, that advice still applies.
Yeah, exactly. On top of the fact that when you're first getting started, you don't know what you're going to enjoy. You don't need to choose, I'm only going to work in this industry, or I'm only going to write this kind of copy. You can't possibly know what you're going to actually like doing until you've been doing it for a while. Exactly. And then the problem too is when you choose a niche, whether again that's an industry or whether it's a type of copywriting, when you choose a niche, then you end up building your portfolio so that it only includes that niche. And even if someone from another niche or someone looking for a different type of copy comes to your website, they're going to assume that you're not going to do it because your portfolio is geared so much toward that niche. The good news is, especially for those of you who like variety, is that you don't have to choose a niche really ever. You know, as you're building out your portfolio, you should be looking to build in as much depth and breadth of experience as possible, showing that you can write for a bunch of different industries with a bunch of different voices and a bunch of different kinds of copy.
Yeah, and as CCA students know, we can't really make assumptions about clients, about anything to do with clients, why they're not responding to you, why they take longer to pay your invoice than they should, all of these things that we start to spin and spin and spin. The same thing goes for high-paying clients. You have no clue what their financial situation is. You have no idea if a business is in the black, in the red, doing well, not doing well. And so there are plenty of high-paying copywriting clients across any industry. I'm going to repeat that. There are high-paying copywriting clients across any industry and every industry. So yes, while we'll talk about a few that you might explore, you can explore any and every industry, and you will find clients who are willing to pay your rate. And quite frankly, in high-paying copywriting industries, you might find copywriting clients that aren't doing super, super well, that can't afford your rate. So go into this process knowing what you can control, which is how much you're charging your pitch, what you're pitching, who you're pitching, and know that you have just as much opportunity in these industries as you do in other industries. On top of the fact that if you choose to niche in one of these industries, I'm just going to remind you about that little thing called the pandemic. And when that happened, there were a lot of copywriters I knew who were in the travel space who only had travel copywriting. And as we all know, that travel didn't happen in the pandemic for a couple of years. And so a lot of people, very, very sadly, had to pivot and find other work. And that was much, much more difficult because their whole entire portfolio was geared toward one industry, intentionally or not.
Yes. So now hearing all of this, you might be asking yourselves, okay, but you just said that we shouldn't choose a niche. And you just said that I can get paid very well as a copywriter in any industry with any size business. So what is the point of this episode? Well, because you guys have been asking us. So we want to answer this question for you because there are certain industries that may tend to pay a little bit higher. And when you guys ask us questions, we're going to answer these questions. But we will also say too, we're talking about industries, but it doesn't mean that you have to go all in on that industry, right? Our students know that you can structure your pitching so that maybe on Monday you pitch to one kind of industry, maybe on Tuesday you pitch to a totally different kind of industry, and on Wednesday and so on. Of course, you can do work within an industry without doing work only within that industry. So that's something I want you guys to remember as we're talking about these specific industries that we're about to mention. I mean, like, talk about really making you wait for
Build
it.
up.
Yeah, exactly. So what are some of the industries that tend to pay a little bit better? Kate, you want to start with the
Number
first
one? Sure. Finance. And everyone thinks, well, duh, money, finance. Again, not always the case. I've actually worked with a company it was a fintech company. So fintech, spoiler, tech is another high paying industry we'll get to. But both of these things together, and guess what? They weren't my highest paying client.
Mm-hmm.
Lovely to work with, but it goes to show it doesn't always pan out that way.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, again, it's one of those industries that tends to have a little bit more cash flow to be able to pay freelancers, employees, etc.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And so to skip to that next one, technology, software, anything in those realms tends to, I feel like we're going to say, tends to, count the number of times we say tends to pay a little bit better because there are more investments into that space.
Mm-hmm.
Companies are very, very focused on technology right now. And as such, there tends to be a lot of investments into these companies, which means that they have bigger budgets for marketing and for growth and all of that kind of thing. But like Kate was saying, the intersection of fintech, which is, of course, if you guys hadn't yet figured it out, finance and technology, it doesn't, you would think, wow, then I'm going to make extra money. And yeah, you may at some companies, but you may not as well at others.
Yeah, and if you're thinking what kinds of companies would these be? So think about apps that you use to split bills with friends, like a Venmo. So intersection of finance and technology, or paid your credit card bill from your phone. And that's just a little bit of what's out there in the fintech space.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there also may be, well, I was going to say fintech, but also finance and technology and also fintech companies that you're just not aware of as a consumer because they are business to business companies, right? They're not selling to you and me, they're selling to other businesses, and which is also kind of a sector in and of itself. I won't call it an industry because it's a little too big to call an industry, but businesses who are selling to other businesses also tend to I won't encourage drinking games, but if we ever had an episode where it was appropriate, this would be the one. The business to business space tends to have a little bit of a bigger budget as well. But so when you're thinking about finance and technology, and don't just limit yourself to what you can think of as a consumer, because there are plenty of finance and technology, and quite frankly, all of the things we're about to talk about that are also in that business to business realm, worth exploring.
Yeah, and thinking about technology companies, from my own experience, I worked at an agency whose big client was Microsoft. That was their main client. And these organizations are huge. Microsoft, Google, Apple, all of these big, big tech companies have kind of, I'm going to call them companies within companies, because each of the departments and sections and products within each company often has its own team working on something. So I was working on a tiny piece of the Microsoft pie when I was there, and it was a business to business sector of the company. And that actually, they shut down the program we were working on. And not just, they continued working with the agency in other capacities, but the specific program I was working on, they just decided, it wasn't serving their purposes. And so I have a lot of anecdotes that feel like they bring bad news on these industries. But all that's to say, my point is that you can look within these companies to pitch specific product lines that you're interested in, or specific people. You're going to find lots of marketing managers. You're going to find lots of potentially even internal creative directors. You're going to find lots of different people working on different aspects of the brand. And so even if you aren't interested in one piece, you might be interested in another piece. I'm thinking about Amazon. They have tons of technology wound up in their business. And, there's different people working on the music side of Amazon versus Amazon Fresh, their groceries, versus all of the stuff on their, the main e-com site. So there's just a lot of different opportunities within a lot of these companies. And so, and there's obviously lots of growth in these companies. You know, Amazon Fresh wasn't a thing a few years ago, but there's also a lot of experimentation within these companies where they could be starting a new product line or a new service that they're offering. And sometimes these products and services grow, and scale. And sometimes it becomes, we tried this and we're actually not going to continue moving forward with this. So there's also a lot of volatility within these companies, within these smaller companies within companies, if you will, within these smaller sectors of the company. So also with tech, though, you can think of software as a service. So like a Dropbox type of situation, Zoom, Square. So there's a lot of companies that maybe you don't think about as needing copy, but they need tons and tons and tons of copy.
Absolutely. And that software as a service, just so you have this little tip, is often referred to as SaaS, SaaS. So if you hear someone talking about SaaS or a SaaS product or a SaaS company, it's not a SaaSy company. It is, or maybe it is as well.
Maybe it is.
Maybe it is. It's a software as a service. So SaaS, a SaaS company. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Well, in another industry that actually kind of is similar to those others is healthcare. Right? Healthcare is a continually growing field. And there are also, there's some intersections with all of this as well. There is actual hospitals, certainly, but there's healthcare technology, there are healthcare programs, there are all kinds of different kinds of companies that fall under the healthcare banner. There is a massive healthcare conference that I am aware of, and the gamut that it runs of the types of companies that fall under healthcare is massive. You guys know that it's not often that we will recommend that you go down a rabbit hole on something, except when it comes to looking for potential companies to pitch. That's when we know, set yourself a time limit, but start doing some research. Go over to the Google and start typing in a company, and then see where that leads, and see what competitors and indirect competitors and conferences and all that kind of stuff. But healthcare is a booming industry, and you can find a lot of opportunities. And again, this is the same with all of these. There are B2C, business to consumer, and there are business to business opportunities. And to Kate's point, like with the other ones, there are often B2C and B2B within the same company. So there are lots and lots of opportunities within that.
Yeah. And there's a lot of focus in healthcare too on eating healthier lifestyles, health coaches, fitness. So there's a lot that falls within the healthcare industry. But one of the things you might be thinking is healthcare, products, services, isn't this language really complex and really, really challenging? Potentially, depending on the company that you're working with. You don't, though, I want to emphasize, you do not need necessarily to niche and get expertise in this to then become, you got to start somewhere, right? All of us have to get our first client in any industry at any point. And so if you can write copy, you can lead with benefit, you can learn about anything within any industry. And that includes these complex topics within healthcare. You can ask your client the questions that you need to ask to get the information you need. But a lot of the time, you don't need to understand what a defibrillator was the thing that comes to mind. Hopefully you do know how a defibrillator works, but in case of emergency. But there are a lot of products that you don't need to know the ins and outs. You need to know enough to be able to communicate that benefit and why it's important. And I'm realizing I'm talking about my own experience in all of these things, but I've worked for a healthcare company where the concepts were these products that I can't even tell you because the names were so complicated and what they serve and help and the benefits of them are so complex. But I can do it is all that's to say, you can absolutely do it.
Well, I think that's true for all of the industries that we've talked about, and actually probably all of the possible industries anyway, but especially finance and technology and healthcare. And you may be thinking, well, if they're going to hire me if I don't have any knowledge of healthcare or finance, or yeah, they absolutely may. Sure, they might also like it even better if you have a little bit of experience, but you need to start somewhere. But it's, as with any client, it's on you to ask your clients the questions to get the information that you need in order to write the project. It's never going to benefit you to pretend like you know what someone's talking about or anything along those lines. And there will be some clients, and Kate, you and I have both had them, where you get into it and you're like, I have no idea what these people are talking about. And you have to say, all right, take me back several steps, or say this as if you were explaining it to your grandmother. So, I've worked in aerospace, and I definitely didn't know anything about aerospace. So I had to learn as much as I could. And that's something that you also need to factor in as you're coming up with your price. You're not learning for free, right? You're learning as part of the project to make sure that you can deliver the best copy possible. And that's, like we said, true with healthcare and finance and technology, but also true of every single client that you work with. You need to take the time to understand what you're talking about, because how could you possibly write it well if you don't actually know what you're talking about?
And quite frankly, most clients of any industry are going to appreciate that in a copywriter much more than a copywriter who says, yeah, I've done work in this industry before, but doesn't know to ask insightful questions that really get them thinking about their own products and services in new ways. You have that outsider perspective, which is really, really valuable. So instead of feeling like, oh, I'm an outsider, imposter syndrome, oh, how could I possibly break into this? Think of it more as, oh, outsider, I have a very fresh perspective. I can come in and ask the questions like a child would to understand this and get new insights and information that maybe they wouldn't, and they probably wouldn't because they're so close to the product and the service. They're so involved in it on a day-to-day basis that yes, they have a wealth of knowledge to share with you, but you also have a wealth of copywriting knowledge to be able to ask these probing questions that get you some nugget or information that you can then write copy in a refreshing, compelling, engaging way that someone who maybe was just going to take the jargon and translate it and not know what the benefit is, or not know why a certain product or service is great for a business or a doctor or a patient, you're going to have that ability, which is really, really special. So use it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. And our fourth one is startups. Now, again, startups can run a pretty big gamut. You can have startups that have absolutely no budget, and you can have startups that have incredible investor funds. I think we all tend to think of the startups that have lots of financial backing. That's what we hear about. And of course, those are the ones that you're going to get a better price for your hours, or they're going to be willing to pay a higher cost for the project or for the hours or however you're billing them. But at the same time, too, don't forget that it's completely possible that a startup maybe doesn't have a ton of backing, or they're just trying to be, if you can believe it, some startups are actually trying to be very financially responsible, and they're not just throwing money, not that throwing money at you would be a bad thing, but throwing money willy-nilly. So they can tend to, there's that tend to again, tend to pay a little bit better, but it really depends on the startup. It's something that we say to students again and again is every company is different, just like every person is different. Sometimes we'll hear from students who say, I'm never going to work on staff at a company ever again. When I was on staff, it was awful. Or I'm never going to work in an agency again. Or on the other side, like, I only work at agencies because I love agencies, or I only want to work on staff because it's going to be totally different with each company. For every fantastic company, there's a crummy one. For every fantastic agency, there's a crummy one. For every fantastic startup, there's a crummy one. So you can't really know what you're getting until you at least start conversations with people. Obviously, look for red flags, but you can't really know what you're going to get until you start having a conversation with a startup, with a healthcare company, with a technology company, or with a finance company. That's where you can start to learn more about the company, what they're looking for from you, and you can start to gauge whether or not they're going to be able to pay your rates.
And one of the things to think about with startups too is that often if you're coming in at the beginning of the startup, some of the work you'll be doing might be a little bit different than what you'd be doing at a company that has been around for years and years and already has an established tone guide and already kind of has direction. You will be more relied upon and leaned on to help even craft that messaging from the get-go. If people don't even know about this product or service yet, you're going to be tasked and challenged with how to write messages that really engage this audience. And you might have to even do digging for them to say, okay, do you even know who your audience is? Have you nailed down, they might have who they think their audience is. And it might be once they launch that product or service that you get a lot of feedback, and you might completely have to change that messaging. And knowing that it's not because you were a bad copywriter, it's not because you failed at your job, it's just the nature of this quick moving company that's learning on as kind of you're building the ship as it's sailing or building the plane as it's flying. You're getting a lot of information back fast, and so there might be a lot of changes and a lot of just tweaking copy so that it continues to perform better. And it could be, I've had this happen before, where it was a complete rewrite, and it wasn't because it was, again, it's not on the copywriter, it's just, okay, we thought it was this one thing, and it turns out this is how the consumers reacted to it, and so we need to kind of message to that a bit better. So if that interests you, obviously that can be a really, really fun challenge. I think for some people who really, really want an established tone guide and to have some sort of parameters and direction, that can be a little bit intimidating to feel like, oh my gosh, I have to build the parameters and boundaries of this brand. So know that. The other thing to consider too, again, with all of these, but particularly with startups, is sometimes they bust. And so for CCA students, always be pitching. You don't want to get into that trap to say, oh my gosh, I love this startup that I'm working with, and forget about your other clients or forget about pitching altogether, because it's again, every industry is volatile, quite frankly, but particularly with startups, because they might secure a large chunk of funding. It might not go the direction it wants, and then they might not secure additional funding for it to kind of the project to continue on. So know that there's obviously a wide variety within this industry, if you will, and obviously tons of different industries within the startup category.
Absolutely. When you mentioned interest, which I want to circle back to, because if someone is listening and they're like, oh, what are these going to be the top industries for making lots of money, which again, knew we'd say it again at least one more time. You can make a lot of money in any industry, in any size company. And you can also find lots of smaller, lots of big companies, lots of industries that don't want to pay you a ton, but there are always going to be plenty that will pay you well. But if you've been listening and you're going, oh, well, healthcare, finance, tax, I'm not interested in any of that, I would challenge you to keep an open mind. I think particularly as copywriters, things get so much more interesting the more that you learn about them. I was just saying I did some work for an aerospace company, and first it's like aerospace, right? But the more that you dig into it and you understand what they're trying to communicate and who they're trying to communicate to and why they're trying to do, and who the target audience is and what their challenges are, and all of this, it can make almost any project fascinating. It's like every project with copywriting, we will always call it a kind of a word puzzle. It's a fun puzzle that you get to combine creativity and strategy. So once you dig into a project, you will often find that it's so much more interesting than you might have thought it was on the outset. And so if you're going, well, I don't want to work in any of those industries, I think we would both caution you to not make assumptions again before you start talking to these companies and before you learn about what these projects are, because even the from the outside, the quote unquote driest projects, or they can turn out to be really, really interesting once you dig into them.
Yeah. Get curious and know that half, maybe more than half of kind of your enjoyment, at least for me on a project, is the people I work with. And so that can make or break any industry or any client in any project, really.
Mm-hmm.
The people that are working on it with you, and how you interact with them, the communication, the process that they might already have for how they do their work. The other thing is too, if there are obviously industries that you're interested in, travel, I feel like is always a big one, or fashion or sports or things like that. Sure, there might be a lot more competition within those industries because they're super popular and people think, well, I would love, like, that seems so cool. Again, it may or may not be. It might be that that's something that interests you as a hobby, but not something that interests you as a copywriting job. It might be that crossing those two things is actually like, oh, well, I love tennis, but I actually don't want to write about it. And it kind of sucks the joy out of the actual sport for me, or whatever it is. So again, experiment, get curious, try things out, try it on a couple of times, because one company might be very different than another company. But know that within these industries that might have a bit more competition, there's still plenty of jobs, and you know how to set yourself apart. If you haven't already, watch the episode about USPs. You can set yourself apart and make yourself the best candidate for those positions within those industries.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, so we wanted to answer the question because we get asked this question all the time of which are the highest paying industries. And so we did. But again, we really do want to emphasize, yes, these can tend to pay a little bit more, but by no means do these need to be the industries that you focus on or the only industries that you pitch to. There are so many different types of companies and organizations and all kinds of opportunities out there. And again, go down the rabbit hole. We tend to see the world through like a keyhole, through our own little perspective, and we only think of the companies that are on top of mind. But once you start digging in and you start seeing all of the possibilities, things can get so exciting because there are so many opportunities and so many different people to work with and companies and organizations to work with, and any number of them can also pay you really, really excellent rates. Are there going to be companies that try to get you for the lowest rate possible? Yeah, of course there are, right? Just like we were saying, there's many different types of companies. There are many different types of people. Some companies are going to be cheap, or some companies are going to try to get someone who does copywriting and design and SEO and social media and all of that stuff. Of course, there are always going to be companies that try to get the magical unicorn who's somehow able to do all of those at an expert level and only wants $20 an hour. Yeah, of course there are. But if you see listings for that, or if you talk to one company and it turns out their rates are super low, please don't make the assumption that that's every company or every company in that industry, or every, if you have an off call with one potential client, that does not mean that every call with every potential client is going to be like that. They're all different. And you owe it to yourself, for the sake of your career, to explore as much as possible, because it will make you a better copywriter. It will make your portfolio more compelling, and it will also just make you a lot happier, because you'll be able to work on all kinds of different things with all kinds of different people. And that, if you ask me, is a major contribution to feeling fulfilled as a copywriter. So we answered your question. We also kind of didn't answer it. Well, we answered it, but then we gave you a lot more than maybe what you were expecting. But it's what you need to know. And if anything, I hope that gets you a little bit excited. No, a lot bit excited, because it's not just 4 industries that will pay you well. It's potentially any industry. So with that, we will catch you in the next episode. Bye, everybody. Like what you heard? Hit subscribe so you never miss a video. And if you're ready to take the first step toward becoming a copywriter yourself, sign up for a free video training right here.